The stage from Cheyenne pulled into Sweetwater Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon in April, 6 days behind schedule, and the first thing Hannah Pierce did when the door opened was apologize for her appearance, before anyone had a chance to react to it. She said, "I know I am not what the letter described. There was a washout on the Laramie Road, and I have been in this dress for 11 days, and I would like to explain if someone will let me before any decisions are made." Daniel Tanner stood at the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the woman climbing down from the stage, and for a moment he did not say anything at all. The hem of her traveling dress was torn through at the side seam, mud-stained to the knee, and one of her boots had a sole that had separated and been tied back on with what looked like a strip of cloth from a petticoat. Her trunk, when the driver set it down, had a broken strap and had clearly been dropped at least once. She was 31 years old, with brown hair coming loose from its pins, and she stood very straight despite all of it. The way a person stands when standing straight is the only thing left that they can control. Daniel had been told, in 3 letters exchanged over 2 months with a placement agency in Cheyenne, that Hannah Pierce was a capable woman of good character, recently widowed, seeking a fresh situation in the territory. He had not been told what 11 days on a delayed stage with a washed-out road would do to a person's appearance, because nobody writes that in a letter, and he had not thought to ask. What I want you to notice, before anything else happens, is what Daniel did next. He did not say anything about the dress. He did not comment on the trunk or the boot. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he said, "You've had a hard road. Let's get you somewhere warm before we talk about anything else." That was all. It was not much, but it was the right amount, and Hannah, who had been bracing for something else entirely, felt something in her chest loosen slightly for the first time in 11 days. Then a small voice said, from somewhere near Daniel's knee, where a child had been standing quietly enough that Hannah had not noticed her, "Please be our mama." The girl was perhaps 6 years old, in a faded blue pinafore, with the particular steady gaze of a child who has learned to watch adults carefully because adults are where information comes from. She had said it simply, the way children say things, without any sense that it might be too much or too soon. She had been told a new mother might be coming. She had been waiting at the gate for an hour, and here was a woman in rags who looked tired and kind, and the girl had said the things she had been holding since breakfast. Daniel went very still. Hannah looked down at the child, and I will tell you now because it matters for everything that follows. Neither of the adults knew, in that moment, what to do with what the girl had just said out loud, in front of both of them, before either of them had said a single word to each other, beyond a greeting. I have looked at the Wyoming Territory stage schedules from the spring of 1883, held in the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne, and a 6-day delay on the Laramie Road was not unusual for that season. The spring melt turned sections of the road into something closer to a riverbed than a road, and stages that were supposed to take 4 days routinely took 8 or 9. What this meant practically, for a woman traveling alone with a single trunk and a limited amount of money set aside for meals along the route, was that she ran out of clean clothes by day 4, ran low on money by day 7, and arrived by day 11, looking exactly like what 11 days of that journey would produce. Hannah Pierce had been a school teacher in Ohio before her husband died of fever in 1881. She had taught for 6 years before marrying, and had gone back to it for 2 years after, in the same small town, in the same schoolhouse, surrounded by people who had known her as a wife, and now knew her as a widow, and treated her with the particular gentle distance that small towns reserve for women whose situation has changed in a way nobody quite knows how to discuss. She had answered the placement notice in a Cincinnati paper in January. The notice had been placed by Daniel Tanner, a rancher in Wyoming Territory with 2 children, a girl of 6 and a boy of 9, whose wife had died of childbed fever the previous autumn along with the infant she had been carrying. The notice did not say all of this, it said. Rancher, 2 children, seeking capable woman for marriage and household management, character references required. Hannah had written back. Daniel had written back. 3 letters each, over 2 months, careful and a little formal, the way letters are between 2 people who are deciding something large based on paper and handwriting, and the small things a person reveals without meaning to. What Hannah had learned from the letters. Daniel Tanner ran 400 acres with cattle and a small herd of horses. His daughter was named Lucy, and his son was named Thomas. He wrote plainly, without much ornament, and he had mentioned in his second letter that Lucy had been asking when the new mother was coming, which Daniel had not quite known how to answer, and he had thought Hannah should know that the children were aware of the arrangement and had opinions about it. What Daniel had learned from the letters. Hannah had taught school for 8 years total. She had no children of her own. She described herself as practical and said she did not need things to be easy, only honest. She had asked, in her first letter, what the children liked, which Daniel had not expected anyone to ask, and he had written back a longer answer than he had intended to about Lucy's drawings and Thomas's habit of naming the barn cats after territorial governors. Neither of them had described what they looked like. Neither of them had asked. This was not unusual for arrangements of this kind, and it was not, in itself, a problem. The problem, if there was one, was that Daniel had formed a picture in his mind anyway, the way people do, made of nothing but the careful handwriting and the practical sentences. And the picture had not included mud, or a torn hem, or 11 days of a journey that had clearly taken something out of her that would need replacing. Lucy Tanner had formed a picture too. Lucy's picture had nothing to do with appearance at all. Lucy's picture was built entirely from one sentence in her father's second letter, which he had read aloud to her because she had asked what the new lady said. The sentence was, "She asked what you like." Lucy had turned this over for 2 months. A grown woman, a stranger in a place far away, had asked a question about Lucy specifically. Lucy had decided, based on this single sentence, that this was a person worth waiting for at the gate. The ranch house was a mile from the crossing, and Daniel drove the wagon while Hannah sat beside him with Lucy wedged between them. And Thomas, who was 9 and considerably more reserved than his sister, rode behind on the small horse he was technically too young to be allowed to handle. Alone, but handled anyway because Daniel had decided some rules were not worth the argument. Lucy talked the entire way. She talked about the cats, whose names Hannah recognized immediately from Daniel's letter, which made Lucy extremely pleased, because it meant the lady had read about them and remembered. She talked about the schoolhouse in town, which she attended 3 days a week when the weather allowed. She talked about her mother briefly, in the unself-conscious way young children sometimes talk about loss, stating it as a fact among other facts. My mother died, and then the baby died too, and Thomas does not like to talk about it, but I do sometimes. Hannah listened to all of this with the particular attentiveness of a former schoolteacher who has spent years learning that children say the most important things sideways, embedded in chatter about cats and schoolhouses, and that the right response is not to seize on the important thing, but to receive it at the same volume as everything else, so the child knows it was heard without being made to feel that they handed over something too large. She said, when Lucy mentioned her mother, "That sounds like it was a very hard year," Lucy said. "It was." And then, without any visible transition, she went back to the cats. Hannah understood this. She did not try to extend the moment. She had learned in 8 years of teaching that children close a door when they are done with it, and the respectful thing is to let the door close. Daniel, driving, said very little during this exchange, but he heard all of it, and something in his shoulders, which had been set in a particular careful way since the stage pulled in, eased slightly. At the house, Daniel showed Hannah to the room that had been prepared for her, which was clean and simple, and had, on the small dresser, a jar with a few early wildflowers in it that had clearly been picked and arranged by a child, because the arrangement had the slightly chaotic abundance of someone who had picked every flower they could reach rather than a careful few. Hannah looked at the flowers for a moment. Then she said, "Did you do this, Lucy?" Lucy, hovering in the doorway, nodded. Hannah said, "Thank you. They're lovely." Lucy beamed and ran off to find Thomas to report, presumably, on the success of the flowers. That evening, after the children were in bed, Hannah asked Daniel if she might use the kitchen for an hour before retiring. He said of course, and asked if she needed anything. She said, "Just a needle and thread if you have them, and maybe a lamp." She spent the hour mending her dress. Not the traveling dress she had arrived in, which was beyond an evening's repair, but a second dress from her trunk, the better of the two she had brought, which had torn at the shoulder seams, somewhere on day 9 of the journey when her trunk had shifted against her in the stage. She mended it carefully, by lamplight, at the kitchen table, and Daniel, who had come back into the kitchen for a glass of water and stayed longer than the water required, watched her work for a while without saying much. He said, eventually, "You don't have to do that tonight," she said. "I know. But I would like to look like myself tomorrow. Today I looked like 11 days on a stage. Tomorrow I would like to look like a person who is choosing to be here, because I am, and I would like that to be visible." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He said, "For what it's worth, you didn't need to apologize at the platform. About the dress." Hannah said without looking up from her sewing, "I know I didn't need to. I wanted to, before anyone had to be polite about it. It's easier that way, for me, I mean." "Not for you," Daniel said. "I understand that." And he did more than she perhaps expected, because he had spent the last 6 months being careful about his own grief in front of people who wanted to be polite about it, and he recognized the impulse. He sat with her for a while as she finished the seam. Neither of them said very much else. The lamp burned low. The house was quiet in the particular way. A house is quiet when there are sleeping children in it, and the day has been longer than expected for everyone. The next morning, before anyone else was awake, Hannah was already in the kitchen, and Daniel found her there when he came in from the early chores, standing at the stove with a cup of coffee already poured for him. Set at his place at the table without comment, he said. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I wanted to see the kitchen properly in daylight, and I think better with something in my hands." The coffee was incidental. Daniel sat down and drank it, and found it was good coffee, better than he was used to making for himself, and he said so, and Hannah said that was a low bar to clear, which made him laugh before he had quite decided to. Over the following days, Hannah took stock of the household the way a person does when they intend to stay, rather than simply pass through. She found the root cellar disorganized in a way that suggested nobody had properly sorted it since the previous autumn, and she spent an afternoon reorganizing it, setting aside what needed using first, and Daniel, coming across her at this task, said only that his late wife had kept it the same way, organized by what would spoil soonest. And Hannah said that was the sensible way to do it, and neither of them made anything further of the comparison, though both of them noticed it had been made without flinching. Thomas, the 9-year-old, took longer than Lucy to warm to the new arrangement, not because he was unkind, but because he was careful, in the way older children sometimes are after a loss, about investing in things that might not last. Hannah noticed this and did not push. She simply made herself reliably present. Breakfast on time, his shirts mended before he noticed they were torn. His questions about the territorial governors, whose names the barn cats carried, answered with more detail than he had expected anyone to have. It was Thomas, in the second week, who first called her by name without the careful formality he had been using. He asked at supper, "Hannah," Did you know Governor Hoyt personally, or just from the newspapers? And Hannah, recognizing the small shift for what it was, answered the question, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which it was rapidly becoming. The marriage took place 8 days after Hannah's arrival, at the church in Sweetwater Crossing, with the minister and 4 witnesses, which was the standard arrangement for situations like this in the territory, and was treated, by everyone present, with a practical seriousness that did not require romance to be present in order to be valid. What I want to describe is not the wedding itself, which was brief and unremarkable, but the 6 weeks that followed, because that is where the actual story is. Hannah ran the household with the same competence the placement agency had promised, and Daniel had, on some level, hoped for without quite believing in. She reorganized the kitchen within the first week in a way that made sense once you saw it, and had clearly not made sense before. She took over Lucy and Thomas's schooling on the days the weather kept them from the schoolhouse, and within a month Thomas, who had been indifferent to reading, was reading 3 books Hannah had brought in her trunk because she had noticed he liked stories about exploration and had, without comment, simply made sure those were the books available. She and Daniel developed a working rhythm that was, on the surface, exactly what the arrangement had promised. A household run well, children cared for, 2 adults sharing a roof and a set of responsibilities with mutual respect and no friction worth mentioning. What neither of them mentioned for 6 weeks was the question of whether there was anything beyond that. They were, by any practical measure, partners. They ate together, discussed the household together, made decisions about the children together. But there was a carefulness between them, a kind of formal courtesy that had not worn off the way Daniel had perhaps expected it to. They did not speak of Daniel's first wife, beyond what the children mentioned naturally. They did not speak of Hannah's husband, beyond the bare fact of his death, which she had mentioned once, briefly, and which Daniel had not pressed on. Lucy, who at 6 years old had none of the carefulness the adults were practicing, asked Hannah directly one afternoon, while they were hanging washing, whether Hannah loved her father. Hannah, caught without preparation for this question, said, "I think your father and I are still getting to know each other, Lucy. That takes time." Lucy considered this, she said. "You held his hand at the wedding." Hannah said, "That's part of the ceremony." Lucy said, "You held it longer than the ceremony needed." Hannah did not have a response to this. She finished hanging the washing in silence, and that evening, at dinner, she found herself watching Daniel in a way she had been trying not to. The way he listened when Thomas explained something at length about the horses, with complete attention and no impatience. The way he had, the previous week, noticed before anyone said anything that Lucy's shoes had worn through at the toe, and had simply gone to town the next day and come back with new ones without making it into anything. She thought about Lucy's observation. She had held his hand longer than the ceremony needed. She had not noticed herself doing it at the time. It was a Thursday evening in late May, 6 weeks after Hannah's arrival, and the pattern repeated itself almost exactly. The children asleep, Hannah at the kitchen table with sewing, this time mending one of Thomas's shirts rather than her own dress, and Daniel coming in for water and staying. He sat down across from her, as he had taken to doing most evenings by now, and for a while neither of them spoke. The lamp was low. Outside, the spring night was doing the things spring nights do in Wyoming, which involved a wind that never fully stopped, and the occasional sound of cattle settling somewhere in the dark. Daniel said, eventually, in the careful tone he used when he had been thinking about something for a while, and had decided to say it, "Lucy asked me something today. She asked if I was going to marry you properly. I told her we already had. She said that wasn't what she meant." Hannah's hands went still on the sewing. She did not look up immediately. She said, "What did you tell her?" Daniel said, "I told her I'd have to ask you about that. Because it wasn't only my answer to give. Hannah set the sewing down. She looked at him. The lamp made the kitchen small and warm in the way lamplight does, a circle of light with the dark territory pressing in just outside the window, and inside that circle, for the first time since the platform 6 weeks ago, neither of them was being careful. She said, "When I got off that stage, I apologized for how I looked before you'd even said hello. I had spent 11 days rehearsing that apology, because I was certain that whatever I'd looked like, it would be the first thing you saw, and I wanted to get ahead of it." She paused. "You didn't say anything about it. You said I'd had a hard road and you wanted to get me somewhere warm." And then Lucy said what she said, and I think, if I am honest, that was the moment I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He said, "I had a picture in my head, from the letters, of what this would be. You didn't match the picture when you got off the stage. But somewhere in the last 6 weeks, I stopped thinking about the picture at all, because the actual version turned out to be better than what I'd imagined. And I didn't notice that happening until just now." Saying it out loud, Hannah said, "That is possibly the nicest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years, sadly. I'm not very good at saying things. I wanted you to know that I noticed." Lucy noticed before either of us did, I think. She usually does. Hannah reached across the table. He took her hand. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence was not the careful silence of the past 6 weeks. It was a different kind. They told the children together, the next morning, over breakfast, in plain terms appropriate to a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, that they had decided beyond the practical arrangement that they wanted to be married properly in the way that meant something beyond paper, and that they had wanted Lucy and Thomas to know first. Thomas, who was 9 and had been quietly observing the household dynamics with more attention than anyone realized, said, "I figured that already," which made Daniel laugh, properly, in a way Hannah had not heard before. Lucy looked between the two of them for a moment. Then she said, "Does this mean you're really my mama now? Not just staying?" Hannah came around the table and knelt down, so she was at Lucy's eye level. She said, "Yes, Lucy, I'm really your mama now. I think honestly I have been for a little while. But yes, now it's official too." Lucy threw her arms around Hannah's neck, and Hannah held her, and over Lucy's shoulder she looked at Daniel, who was watching with an expression she had not seen on him before, something unguarded that he usually kept carefully put away. The mended blue dress hung in Hannah's wardrobe for the rest of her life. She wore it often in the early years, until it finally wore through beyond mending in a way that even her careful needlework could not address. When Lucy, years later, asked why her mother kept a dress that was clearly too worn to wear anymore, Hannah told her it was the dress she had been wearing when someone first called her mama. And some things you keep not because you need them, but because of what they remind you happened.